Chapter 1, Jonathan Harker's Journal, 3rd of May. Left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early next morning. Mina Murray's Journal, 26th of July. I am anxious and it soothes me to express myself here. It's like whispering to oneself. A memorandum left by Lucy Westenra, 17th of September. I was waked by a flapping at my window, which had begun after that sleepwalking on the cliff at Westminster Gazette, 25th of September. In all these cases, the children were too young to give any properly intelligible account, but the consensus of their excuses is that they had been with the Bloofer lady. Dr. Seward's diary, 29th of October. Jonathan Harker's Journal, 8th. Dr. Van Helsing's memorandum, 5th of November. In 1897, author Bram Stoker published his vampire novel, Dracula. It wasn't the first vampire story. Stoker had plucked inspiration from folklore, as well as historical figures such as Vlad the Impaler, and even newspaper clippings with true accounts of so-called vampirism, such as the Mercy Brown vampire incident from 1892. Stoker took all of these influences and used them to tell an exciting contemporary story, all told via journal entries, letters, telegrams, and newspaper articles about a monstrous vampire from Transylvania travelling to England to feast on women's blood. Dracula became one of the most famous and successful works in English literature history, and Count Dracula himself has become the most portrayed fictional character of all time. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the vampire, and we look at Bram Stoker's seminal 1897 novel, Dracula. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munter, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres, one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 8th season, exploring the evolution of the vampire, and this is part 2. In this episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be looking at the Bram Stoker 1897 novel, Dracula, in spoilerific detail. Okay, so for the first time ever on this podcast, we are purely going to be looking at a book and not a film or television show. It's a beast of an episode this week. It's a big one because I've got 2 brilliant discussions to give you on this topic. So later on in the episode, I'll be joined by writer, director, podcaster Adam Robinson to discuss Dracula in spoilerific detail. But first, I thought it would be great to have a little introductory chat, an overview of Dracula as a character and Dracula as a story, just to talk about its origins, its influences, and the legacy that it's left behind. And there is literally no other better person on the planet to talk about this than this particular guest. I sat down with the brilliant writer, scholar, critic Kim Newman to discuss Dracula. Now, of course, not only is Kim Newman one of the most respected and beloved horror critics in the world, he is also an author, and he's had huge success with his series of vampire novels, Dracula novels, no less, the Anno Dracula series. The first book in the series is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. So I sat down and chatted to Kim Newman about what Dracula as a character means to him and about how it's inspired pretty much everything he's done in his life since he first discovered this incredible seminal story. So apologies in advance. I did chat to Kim via Zoom and his sound quality is a bit ropey at times. So apologies for that in advance, but I think you'll still really enjoy this discussion. So here is my chat with Kim Newman on all things Dracula. I'm very excited to welcome back to the podcast Kim Newman. Hello, Kim.
Hello.
Hello. So there's a lot that I want to ask you. Obviously, you are the man that knows everything there is to know when it comes to vampires and particularly Dracula. But let me start at the beginning with you, Kim. Where and when do you remember first discovering Dracula, the character and the story?
Yeah, it's slightly embarrassing to be honest. like many of my generation, the first time I saw Dracula was on Doctor Who. It's the third Dalek serial, The Chase, which is probably the point when Doctor Who started to have a sense of its own history and started making fun of itself a bit. It's the one that features the Beatles and the Daleks on the Marie Celeste. But there's a whole episode where they go to what seems to be a haunted house, and they meet and Daleks and Doctor Who and whoever was traveling with him at the time meet the Frankenstein monster and Dracula.
Good evening.
Good evening. Who are you?
I am Count Dracula.
But you can't be. I mean, not really.
But for me, the life-changing encounter with Dracula is Bela Lugosi. When I was 11 years old, I was allowed to stay up late on a Friday night to watch the horror film, which was a kind of mythic thing at the time. It was had to be Friday night because it was after your bedtime if you're a school kid. And that was like, for me, it's like the bat coming in through Bruce Wayne's window, where he dedicates his whole life to something after it. But for me, it was the bat on a string in the Lugosi movie. And it's like overnight, I became like a horror movie fan. And by extension, probably a committed movie fan. I also instantly rushed out and got the book, because that was what you did when you couldn't record films or own them or whatever. You went back to the literary source first, and Dracula was obviously still in print. I vividly remember the first edition of Dracula I owned, which was an Arrow paperback. It had a great cover of a woman who looked a bit like a young Queen Victoria with a sort of Dracula's hand on her shoulder. And at that time, the Universal horror movies were in the UK owned by ITV, who they put on late night seasons of clutches of them, usually under, I think on my ITV region, it was called Appointment with Fear, but they all had different, and actually that's a bit cheeky because that's stealing the title of a BBC horror franchise from the radio, The Man in Black. But I wrote that in that little clutch that started with Dracula, I saw Son of Dracula and The Werewolf of London. Later, I think they showed all the Frankenstein movies in order and all that. And it was a couple of years after that, the BBC got the license to all those Universal films and started showing them on double bills on Saturday nights in the summer, which is clever because it was through the school holidays. And they would double bill a Universal film with usually a Hammer film. So you'd have in theory, a creaky old black and white movie, and then a much more recent in color movie, although of course we only had a black and white TV set, so they're all creaky old black and white movies. Right? So that was, for my generation of British horror fans, the education we had. That was all there was. You'd watch these films on TV. I did see the last couple of Hammer Dracula movies, Scars of Dracula, Dracula 1872, Standing Rise of Dracula, Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, in the cinemas at first run. So even though Lugosi was like the first Dracula for me, Christopher Lee was the regular Dracula.
It's really interesting that, isn't it, depending on your generation as to who is your Dracula, whether it's Christopher Lee or Gary Oldman or Bela Lugosi.
The thing is, I don't know if there is a current Dracula except Adam Sandler.
Yeah.
And actually Adam Sandler has stopped playing that role. He was replaced in the last Hotel Transylvania. But, I mean, I think he's played the role 3 times, which is one more time than Bela Lugosi did on film.
There you go.
Yeah. So in fact, I think Adam Sandler is. John Carradine's played it more often, and maybe one or two other actors have, through appearing in different versions, have played Dracula or equivalent characters more often. But Adam Sandler, after John Carradine and Christopher Lee, is the Dracula of the age. So there you go.
I love it. So what was it about that story and that character that really kind of struck a chord with you initially when you first saw that 1931 film particularly?
I think it's just the way it's Lugosi's look and the whole style. I think that if you look at Dracula in terms of the Universal Monsters franchise, which that's a whole iteration of Dracula. There's another iteration which devolves from Max Schreck in Nosferatu, which is a whole other side. And there's a Hammer Dracula, which starts with Christopher Lee. And there are various other but the Dracula of the Universal films, it starts with Lugosi, who's then replaced by Lon Chaney Jr. and John Carradine. But those are still the classical versions of the stories. I actually think Dracula is, as a film, less strong, certainly, than Frankenstein or The Mummy or The Old Dark House. But it's the first, so it gets kind of leeway for that. And I think I've probably watched it more often than I watch Frankenstein. The Universal Dracula, because he was the first of that run of monsters, that gives him like pole position. He's like the prime monster. And you see this in, it's a joke, but in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And subsequently in things like The Monster Squad or Van Helsing, all those stories where you get a bunch of monsters together, Dracula is the boss of the monsters. Is it? Yes. It's like, I don't know if it's because he's a count or a genius or a general or whatever. And even in Hotel Transylvania, he runs the hotel. And like the Frankenstein monster and the Wolfman and the Mummy and all this, they're stooges. So he is still, I think, the king monster. I mean, I doubt if he could give orders to Godzilla, but otherwise, yeah. And he is Prince of Darkness. Yeah, so that gives him the position of being the leading man of the horror franchise that is all the monster movies jumbled together into one big thing in your mind, which I think is what most fans have of that notion of classic horror. There is no one who can quite go up against him.
That's right. And I guess vampires have a little bit more personality. They have a little bit more charisma than a lot of other classic monsters.
Yeah. Anne Rice didn't write a book called Interview with the Werewolf, right? Or Interview with the Zombie, because it wouldn't actually work.
Yeah.
The thing is, vampires are capable of unrestrained savagery, but they can also sit down and have a conversation with you. And indeed, one of the scenes that's there are in so many versions of Dracula, and they all take different bits and pieces. But one of the scenes that almost all versions of Dracula have is Jonathan visiting the castle. And it's the dialogue. They sit down and talk. And Dracula is sort of creepy and sort of magnificent and sort of pathetic and talks a lot. And then for the rest of the book, you only sort of see him through windows or in shot sequences. But we learn enough about it through conversation. I think that's why actors prefer playing Dracula to playing the Wolfman. I mean, the Wolfman is like, you get a bit of angst in the daytime and then the makeup takes over. With Dracula, it's all in the performance. It's all in the look. And there's a whole bunch of stuff to do with the various costume elements, the cloak. But somehow every time they try and change the Dracula costume in a way, it doesn't take. It always comes back to the cloak. And frankly, it always comes back to Bela Lugosi as well. It's like Adam Sandler does Bela Lugosi, doesn't do Christopher Lee. Gary Oldman did Bela Lugosi. Yeah, it's like there seems to be no other way of playing that role.
And yet, it's been portrayed more than any other character, right? I think even more than Sherlock Holmes, Dracula is the most portrayed character on screen in sort of pop culture history, right?
You must know that I do this Your Daily Dracula on social media. So where every day I post frame captures from moving image performance versions of Dracula, which means films, television shows, cartoons. A lot of stage productions have been filmed and are online, so I've used a lot of those, and trailers for ballet productions, high school theatre Draculas, lots of short films, lots of stuff. When I started doing this, I thought there's about 3 months worth of this. I'm coming up to 2 years, and there is literally no end in sight. It's like every time I see a reference to something I haven't got, I go online to track it down and find 10 more Mexican wrestling movies or Spanish Dracula comedies, or I say high school productions of Dracula. I think that's not going to stop. There have been other characters. Sherlock Holmes is still perennially popular. The Frankenstein monster sticks around, but there are less Frankensteins than there are Draculas. I think historically, Frankenstein films gross less than Dracula movies. And I don't entirely know why. It may be that Dracula is just a sexier subject.
Well, that's it. He is, isn't he? And I think there's something that other storytellers like doing where they can play with and mold that character in different ways. I mean, you yourself, Kim, so you've written a whole successful series of books for 30 years now, the Anno Dracula books, right? Where you take the character of Dracula and you put him in these different scenarios, right? The idea of the first book being, what if Dracula had won, right? What if he had beat Van Helsing and taken over England? How would that look? And you know, you and many other people and storytellers have kind of found ways to use Dracula. You know, he's a character that just kind of prompts that kind of imagination.
Yeah, this year, it's the 30th anniversary of Anno Dracula. There's a splendid new edition coming out, for which I have written a new novella. And when I wrote the first book, I thought, oh, this is probably a series. I didn't envision that I'd still be doing it 30 years later. And it's not like, I don't know, Game of Thrones or something, where there's an overall story that's just not finished. You know, it is something where each of the novels is self-contained and is a story unto itself. And every time I do one, or even a story, I think, well, that might be it. And then a couple of years later, an idea comes back that can only be done as an Anno Dracula story. And I admit that the series has got away from Dracula and even sometimes gets away from vampires, but there is so much material and a lot. And the person whose name we've not mentioned yet is Bram Stoker, who was not actually a great writer, but he wrote one great book. And it may well be the fact that he wasn't, he wasn't Joseph Conrad or Henry James, but his book has more kind of weird loose ends and things that you can pick up on and do odd things with. I know there have been books about Mina or Renfield or Van Helsing or all the supporting characters. I mean, I don't know if anyone's done Mr. Swales, the boring old Yorkshire guy, but you could. There are all kinds of ways. People have done books about each of Dracula's 3 nameless wives. There are bits and pieces, and that's not even counting just going into Dracula himself. How much stuff is there? And it's hard to think of contemporary horror works that would be amenable to that. I suspect Stephen King probably would, but he's done it all himself. In order for Dracula to become open source, which was actually very contested. Bram Stoker's widow sued the makers of Nosferatu, and there are all kinds of hassles over the rights. And similarly with Sherlock Holmes, but it takes sort of like 70 years before stuff to get into the public domain to the point where other writers can play around with it. And how many franchises last 70 years? I mean, are we? Stephen King's doing very well at the moment, but 70 years after he passes on, will his work still have the currency that will make people want to write? Stories about young Kurt Barlow or the chef from The Shining. I mean, which might be interesting, but I'm not sure if in 70 years' time there will be a market for those kind of reiterations of those figures. And of course, Stephen King's Salem's Lot is itself a rewrite of Dracula, so he's he's well aware of how this works.
Let's talk about Bram Stoker's novel then. You mentioned Bram Stoker himself may not have been the best writer, but he wrote this fantastic novel. I often find with some of these sort of books from this era, these very, sometimes they can be more important than they are enjoyable, if that makes sense. Do you find Dracula, Bram Stoker's novel, as well as being an important read, is it still an enjoyable read, in your opinion?
I have to say, Dracula doesn't read as well as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Carmilla. Or H.G. Wells, or some of the best of Conan Doyle, because Stoker, strangely, wasn't really a professional writer in the way they were. I think of those, that little clutch of really important novels, probably Jekyll and Hyde is the one that stands up the best. It's shortest. You could give an intelligent 12-year-old a Stevenson book and they would zip through it. Mm-hmm. They might struggle with Dracula. Dracula, it sort of wheezes and creaks around the corners, but it's got passages that are so powerful that it's still a page turner.
Obviously, there had been a couple of other literary examples of vampire stories before Bram Stoker, right? You had the novel The Vampire. There were Penny Dreadful stories, I believe, right? And you also had Carmilla. The vampire goes back in terms of folklore a lot longer than that. But where do you think Bram Stoker got the idea for Dracula himself? A lot of people have talked about how he was based on Vlad the Impaler, right? This kind of Romanian ruler from the 1400s. And of course, in Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation, we do actually see a kind of backstory to Dracula, right, where he is Vlad the Impaler. But that's not actually mentioned anywhere in the novel, is it? Was Bram Stoker actually consciously basing Dracula on Vlad the Impaler?
No, because in the original draft, the character was called Count Vampire, which is a terrible name. He came across... various people have said to a greater or lesser extent that he was, that Dracula is Vlad the Impaler. He's sort of Vlad the Impaler. There are a few mentions in the book, but he is as much Vlad the Impaler as D'Artagnan or Cyrano de Bergerac are the real people who happen to have those names, which is to say, not very. There are a few bits and pieces, but there are also some really significant things in the character of Dracula which contradict being Vlad the Impaler. It's kind of become a useful. I mean, I use it in Anno Dracula, and I know, the first person version of the story to really use it as a backstory is a radio play from the 1970s, and then there was this book called In Search of Dracula, which has cast a shadow over many subsequent versions. I think we're drifting away from it. When Gerard Butler played Dracula, he turned out to be Judas, which was...
That's right.
Which was at once a brilliant idea and a stupid idea. Apart from anything else, it meant that Dracula was Jewish. But it was clever in that it explained why he didn't like silver or the cross, because they're bad memories, which I like. but it didn't really work. But and other people have done versions of Dracula who aren't Vlad the Impaler. If you look online, you can find an epic rap battle between Dracula and Vlad the Impaler, which sort of doesn't quite settle who is the real Dracula.
The story is an epistolary novel as well, right? Which means it's all told through letters, diary entries, journals, that kind of thing. Was this one of the first sort of successful novels to do that? And do you think that kind of adds something to this particular story?
It's not quite something that Stoker invented. I think he was very influenced by Wilkie Collins, who uses a similar device in The Moonstone. But there, it's much more like a series of novellas that glue together into one overall story with narrators. Whereas Dracula is sort of like found footage. It's a collage of diaries, newspaper entries, and telegrams. And actually, there's even this sort of found footagey thing in it. There's an afterword which talks about how all the components have been assembled, as if this has happened and someone is compiling a book of the evidence. So the publication of the novel itself is part of the story of Dracula, and in that way, it's almost modernist in its storytelling approach. I think of it as it's like a techno thriller rather than a gothic horror novel. It doesn't try and it evokes the past. The monster comes from the past, but it's full of railway timetables and gadgets and high tech. I mean, all the stuff about the Dr. Seward using a dictaphone to dictate his diary. It's kind of the sort of device that you would get in a found footage video diary type horror. All these things that came along later.
Yeah, but also one of the things I find really fascinating about it is that given that it's one of the most influential horror novels of all time, with possibly the most adaptations of anything, there have been very few adaptations that feel like they actually faithfully stick to this book. I think we'll talk about the adaptations in a moment, but so many of them owe more of a debt to the stage play, right, which the 1931 movie kind of adapted, and then in turn it kind of inspired the rest of the movies. And why has nobody done a completely faithful adaptation of this book? And what do you think is the most faithful?
Well, in terms of sort of mainstream versions, there's the BBC's production, Count Dracula, with Louis Jourdain, which was it was a 3-part miniseries that later tended to air as a one long film. And I think that's got more of the characters and the incidents, even than Francis Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, which sort of sold itself as the most faithful version and probably had more characters from the book, but diverged from it in all kinds of ways. The BBC version didn't. I'll put it like this. The BBC version has the scene where Dracula feeds his wives a baby in a bag, which is one of those things that you think that the censorship standards of 1897 are now rather tame, and blue stocking and prudish. Most Dracula movies don't have the baby in the bag scene, which is still a shocking moment.
It's crazy that actually, isn't it, when you think of the amount of films and adaptations and successful ones that there are still many that don't include many of those key sort of horror elements from the novel as well.
I think, after one of the things that Coppola tried to do was reframe it as a love story rather than a horror story, which doesn't quite work for me. It's an interesting reading, but it means you have to tip in this whole plot from The Mummy about the searching for the reincarnation of the lost love. Coppola wasn't the first to do that. It's in the Jack Palance TV film from the 70s, and that borrows a lot from Dark Shadows, the American TV soap, which had a vampire who was searching for the reincarnation of his lost love. Even before The Mummy, that was in She. But it's not. Somehow, it's not a congenial plot for Dracula. What's Dracula's motivation? Yeah, that's the thing. In the novel, it's kind of bloodlust and conquest, which is fine. That's a good villain motivation, isn't it?
Yeah.
But just wanting to get back with his long dead girlfriend it doesn't quite. It's particularly since the first thing he does when he meets her again is seduce her best friend. Yeah, and you think, well, no wonder you lost her. But yeah, that said, there's this. I really like the Hammer film version of Dracula, and Dracula's motivation in that is he wants his library indexed. So, and I think it's a problem that a great many people who have done versions of Dracula had is, what does Dracula want? Yeah, he kind of has to be the prime mover in there. And so you get things like that Hammer film where he wants to kill everybody in the world with a plague and then commit suicide with an empty earth. And okay, that's sort of ridiculous and it's kind of Bond villainy. But at least it's magnificent. At least it's huge. Whereas, other Hammer films, like The Scars of Dracula, is a tiny story, isn't it? And it makes Dracula seem sulky and small. And I think you can't really do that. You want some kind of grand scheme from it.
Let me just quickly ask you then about some of these key adaptations. Now, the first one, of course, I need to ask you about is Nosferatu. Although there was a lost earlier silent movie that was an adaptation of Dracula, right? But that's gone.
Technically, there's this Hungarian thing.
Yes.
Yeah, the film is lost. One or two pictures survive, and a novelization or a prose adaptation survives, which was translated recently. And it seems to be it's much closer to Dr. Caligari than Dracula. The Dracula in that isn't even explicitly a vampire. So there is a sort of ambiguity as to how much of a Dracula movie that is. But Nosferatu, we know it's a Dracula movie because it was proved in court to be a Dracula movie. It was. Florence Stoker, the widow of Bram Stoker, sued it for being a plagiarism and won. So it's a Dracula movie. Perhaps foolishly, they didn't acquire the rights to the novel and made a film which changed all the names. Dracula became Count Orlok. All the other characters are renamed as well. It's Hutter rather than Harker, and Nina rather than Mina. All of which, I've got to say, if you're changing the names, if you're filing the serial numbers off properly, you change it a lot more than they did.
Yeah.
And it's a sketch of the novel. So much of the complications of the novel are and it also does something fundamentally different. It's as different from what Stoker was doing as Francis Coppola's version is, in that Stoker's story has a contemporary setting. It's about Dracula coming from the past to modern day London. Nosferatu is set back. It's put back into the early 19th century. It's distanced in time. And it is also weirdly a romantic story. Nosferatu is repulsive and dies for love. He lingers because the heroine keeps him up after dawn, and then he dissolves in the sunlight, which seems to be something that Murnau invented. It's not in previous versions of the story. It's sort of like a mirror image of something that happens in The Vampire with Moonlight, which revives the vampire. But here, sunlight kills the vampire. But the main thing that Nosferatu has is Max Schreck and the makeup. Because it's a silent film. He didn't have to deliver any dialogue, so they can do whatever they want to his face. One reason why Bela Lugosi isn't wearing fangs is because nobody could speak through them at that time. But the look of all, and the film celebrates its centenary this year. I'm going to a centenary screening tomorrow. For something that's 100 years old, it's still terrifying. It's still perhaps the most frightening visual version of a vampire we've had. And people go back to it over and over. It's like every year somebody makes a vampire movie in which the vampire looks like Max Schreck in 1922.
Yes, I agree with you. And it is still, to this day, visually one of the scariest adaptations of Dracula, I would say. Then, of course, we go 10 years later to Dracula 1931. As you've already mentioned, this was the kind of formative movie for you, probably so many people, Bela Lugosi, Universal. And I guess, I mean, I remember one of the first times we chatted together on the podcast, Kim, you argued that in many ways, Dracula 1931 is the start of the horror genre, right? As a genre of cinema, this is the movie that kind of started it all. And I guess, you know, it has these sequels as well. It's sort of the first ever horror franchise.
Yeah, I think that before Dracula, you can find uses of the term horror film. But I think before Dracula, people didn't quite understand it in the way that we now do. After Dracula, they did. I think, and when, because the film is very closely based on, or most of it is closely based on stage production, it had been a Broadway hit and a West End hit in a slightly different version. Lugosi had played the role on Broadway. If you look at the posters for that, the subtitle is The Vampire Play. And when people describe it, they tend to Lugosi uses the term mystery play or mystery story when interviewed about it, because that was a thing that people understood. It was the genre of the cat and the canary and the bat and various other spooky old dark house type mysteries, most of which have like Scooby-Doo endings, where the mask comes off and it's the sinister heir or the butler or the detective has disguised themselves as a monster in order to find a treasure in the basement or whatever. And the original stage version of Dracula has this speech at the end where the actor playing Van Helsing comes out and sort of underlines the fact that it's been a real game changer to have an actual supernatural monster. And he talks, and it's sort of joke speech where the punchline is, there are such things, so you can go home terrified that monsters will get you, as opposed to the reassurance you're supposed to get from the old man Withers and the haunted carnival. With that, horror becomes a thing that you can do, and I think obviously Universal, having had a hit with Dracula, they made Frankenstein, and then they made The Mummy and loads of other stuff. And because Universal had a hit, MGM and Paramount and Warner Brothers, they looked around and they did Fu Manchu and Jekyll and Hyde and Dr. Moreau and Mystery of the Wax Museum, Dr. X, all these things. So, and all this is like between 1931 and 1933. You can find there are like 15 American horror films, and a lot of them have Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi in, and even like the supporting actors in Dracula, they turn up in a bunch. It's like you couldn't make a horror film without a bunch of these people, and the look of Dracula, which is influenced by the look of Nosferatu, becomes reproducible, becomes a style that people can play with. Even because it's an early talkie, the sound of Dracula, the sound of of Lugosi's voice, but stuff like whistling winds and creaking timbers and all this stuff becomes part of what horror films do. And that clutch of films are materially different from silent movies like The Phantom of the Opera or The Cat and the Canary that we now retroactively rope in as horror films. But by the end of 1932, when there have been all these movies, then a writer could go into a studio and say, let's make a horror film. And everybody in the room would understand what they meant.
Then, of course, we enter the sort of Hammer era. And what do you think of, Christopher, that the way that Hammer kind of create their own Dracula franchise with lots of sequels? How do those movies compare to the Universal ones?
Well, I think that obviously the first Hammer Dracula, Horror of Dracula America, it's unlike Universal. Hammer started by making a Frankenstein movie, The Curse of Frankenstein. Almost all other versions of this cycle, start with Dracula and go on to Frankenstein. Hammer didn't do that. They made this their Frankenstein movie, which is built around Peter Cushing, and logically, as soon as that was a huge hit, they greenlit The Revenge of Frankenstein. Whereas, as opposed to the Universal films that brought the monster back, they brought Peter Cushing back. Christopher Lee was dissolved in acid as the monster, but Peter Cushing's Dr. Frankenstein, who actually went to the guillotine in Curse of Frankenstein, comes back in The Revenge of Frankenstein. But at the same time, they branched out and they greenlit a Dracula. And weirdly, if you look at their version of Dracula, it's built around Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. As I said, Dracula is a guy who wants his library catalogued. Van Helsing has sent Jonathan Harker to the castle to kill Dracula. Van Helsing knows Dracula is a bad guy and is planning to destroy it. So it's a Van Helsing-led story. And Dracula isn't in it that much. Christopher Lee is almost an afterthought in it. It's a film built entirely around... And Peter Cushing is brilliant as Van Helsing. It's not the character from the book, but it's a much stronger sort of film lead action guy. But because Lee's Dracula isn't in it that much, he has to make a big impact when he's on screen. And exactly like the character in the book, you get him talking at the beginning, and then he's ferociously violent and terrifying, and then he just pops up and does snarling and action and brutal stuff throughout the film in tiny little moments. It's an astonishingly effective narrative device, and Lee's performance. Or it's not even a performance, it's a physical presence. I think later Lee became rather frustrated with the fact that when he played Dracula, it's like he didn't really need to turn up as an actor. He sort of had to turn up almost as a stuntman or as an icon. And the thing is, it really works in the films. It was probably enormously frustrating to play after a while when you have some of the later movies. I think Taste the Blood of Dracula is one of my favorites, where Dracula doesn't really do much except lurk. It's like he has some staring eyes, he bites a few people. But you can imagine from Christopher Lee's point of view, he probably thought that was a terrible movie because he wasn't involved in all the good stuff, the character and the drama and the dread. But the thing about the Hammer's Dracula is they get wilder and stranger, but they don't get comic. Hammer films quite often have effective comedy relief, but when they're doing the scary stuff, there's none of the jokiness that almost all versions of the story subsequently have. It's odd. Sometimes people tend to misremember Hammer and think that they were rather camp, but they very rarely go that route. There are one or two films that verge on it, but mostly, if anything, they err on the side of being serious, slightly sort of solemn. And that, as an approach, and it lasted from 1958 to 1973, so not a huge run, but still 15 solid years of serious scariness. And weirdly, Christopher Lee made funny vampires in Italy, and later he made a funny Dracula movie in France. So, he provided an Abbott and Costello version of his Dracula, but Hammer didn't.
There's some really interesting spins on Dracula and versions of Dracula through the 70s too, isn't there? As things got slightly weirder. And, obviously you've got movies like Blackula. And then in the late 70s, I think both in 1979, you've got Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, and we've got Dracula with Frank Langella as well, right? And there's some really kind of weird, interesting films.
Well, I'll put it like this. In 1979, in 2 days, I was able to see Langella's Dracula, the Herzog Nosferatu, and Love at First Bite.
Wow.
And on one day, in one cinema, I was able to see 2 of those just by walking from one street to the next. And I've got to say, the breakout hit of that was Love at First Bite. the other two versions, although they've accrued a reputation over the years, weren't initially enormous hits. And actually, they're both films that I had problems with when I first saw them, that I've warmed up to. I still think both of them are slightly overshadowed in my mind by the Louis Jourdan TV version, which I like a lot more. But they both have these. There's something odd about the way Langella seems like an American. He's a sort of, he is. I mean, it's John Badham had just made Saturday Night Fever, so he is kind of disco Dracula, isn't he? With the bouffant hair and the floppy shirt and all that. Although that film has some really good moments in it. It felt at the time rather superfluous. Also, you've got to remember it came out around the same time as George Romero's Martin. As films which were sort of really stretching the envelope of what vampire movies were. And mixed in, there had been things like the Count Yorga films or Grave of the Vampire. There was a lot of Carmilla-derived sort of sexy lesbian vampire movies in the 70s as well. Jean Rollins films and the Hammer film, The Vampire Lovers with Ingrid Pitt. And there were a bunch of other adaptations of that story or versions of that story. And in there was Salem's Lot as a novel and then as a TV miniseries. And I think one of the things in the 1970s, there were probably more vampire movies than at any other time in history. And you can see there's this tension. Blackula actually is a really interesting movie. It's sort of saying what different can we do with a vampire, and the idea that Dracula is a racist as well is kind of cool. But also the idea of an African vampire in Los Angeles, there's a culture clash stuff going there, and it has some genuinely terrifying bits. And I'm a particular fan of Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which is like, what if vampires were just really scary? And I think that's it. You see there's a tension between people who are inclining towards making love at first bite, which I think even some of the straight vampire movies of the 70s can't resist putting in some jokes. And then there are people who are trying to say, well, we're going to make a vampire movie. How can we make it scary? Or magical or poetic or strange or odd. And you have this sort of big flourish. And actually, at the end of the 70s, where they say that you have this glut of Dracula adaptations, and that sort of shuts it down. For most of the 80s, there weren't that many vampire movies. I mean, people remember Fright Night and The Lost Boys and Near Dark. And that's about it. After that, you're looking at the Graveyard Shift movies, which went direct to video. And then around the time of the Coppola film, which is 30 years ago, 1992, that was the year of John Landis's Innocent Blood and the film of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And both of those turned out to be surprisingly influential for films that didn't do business when they first came out. And I think throughout the 90s, you see a mushroom growth of vampire project. Obviously, they finally filmed Interview with a Vampire. And then there were a whole bunch of TV series. There was Dark Shadows revival in there briefly. There was the TV version of Buffy. There were various, Forever Night and Angel and Moonlight and all these sort of, vampire TV shows. And a lot of sort of more serious things like Abel Ferrara's The Addiction or Larry Fessenden's Habit. It's sort of vampires came back. People started doing vampire stories again. And that's never really stopped. I think it's whatever that wave that started in the 90s has not gone away. Every time it looks like it's about to die down, there's another bunch of TV series and movies and books. And I don't say it'll never go out of fashion. It'll never stop. But I can't see it stopping anytime soon.
That's really interesting. But what about Dracula itself? Like you say, vampires are still extremely popular, but Have we had a really iconic Dracula adaptation since Gary Oldman's in 1992?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you notice is there have been a lot of Dracula movies since Gary Oldman, but there haven't been that many really great Draculas.
Yeah,
there have been a lot of really bad Draculas. I think probably Dominic Purcell in Blade Trinity stands as the worst serious Dracula. But frankly, Richard Roxburgh is terrible in Van Helsing, and there are a bunch of other. Mark Warren did a really poor Dracula on television. I think Clay Spahn wasn't bad in the BBC's last stab at Dracula, but somehow what he did was just bits and pieces of everybody else's Dracula. So he didn't put his own stamp on it in the way that... And it's like for really good Draculas in the last 30 years, you have to look at things like that Guy Maddin ballet version, Dracula, Pages from a Virgin's Diary. And I don't know, does anybody remember Jonathan Rhys-Meyers as Dracula in a TV series that didn't get recommissioned? It wasn't bad, but the version of the character didn't quite click. It's like they've been sort of moving around for takes on Dracula. Luke Evans did it in the end. I don't know if it is the thing that when you're playing Dracula now, there's a sense that you've got Max Schreck, Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, maybe Gary Oldman, maybe Adam Sandler, looking over your shoulder, and what can you do? Oh, the one that we've not mentioned that I really like is Udo Kier in Blood for Dracula. But that's a comical version. But it's a comical version with a sort of melancholy, tragic undertone. And that's a reading that sort of works.
Yes. And actually, I believe Nick Cage is going to be playing Dracula at some point soon as well, in a Renfield
But that's
movie.
in a film which is about Renfield.
Yeah.
So presumably, I mean, in fact, Nicolas Cage did a sustained homage to Max Schreck in Vampire's Kiss, where he even eats a cockroach. Yeah, I don't know. And even that's sort of a sly comic performance rather than a serious one. And I suspect that, and there's a new version of The Munsters coming up as well.
Yes, Rob Zombie. I believe,
that's right. Yeah. So, versions of Dracula, we're not going to be short of them. Or we're not going to be short of Draculas. It would be nice to have. It's strange that for all that you can argue about the various interpretations, every 10 or 15 years we get a new Sherlock Holmes. Widely embraced in the way that, Benedict Cumberbatch sort of was widely embraced in the way that Jeremy Brett or Peter Cushing or Basil Rathbone were. We haven't had a Dracula who's been widely embraced as Dracula.
It's so true, isn't it? And I wonder if it's still... The shadow of Bela Lugosi looms over every other portrayal of Dracula, I would say. Like that presence, that physicality, that costume, that accent, it's still at the forefront of everyone's mind, I think.
After Bela Lugosi played Dracula, there was, Lon Chaney took over the role in Son of Dracula, and then John Carradine. Neither of them do Bela Lugosi's accent, right? And Christopher Lee didn't either, but everybody else does.
Yes, even the Sesame Street character.
That's right. I don't know. It's like, will somebody come up with another way of saying I am Dracula that is not Christopher Lee's or not Lugosi's? Until they do, probably there isn't much you can do to establish yourself as like a reigning Dracula in the way that Cumberbatch or Robert Downey Jr. are a reigning Sherlock Holmes.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I guess I just want to finish by going back to that novel. And you mentioned already that novel came in such an interesting time where we had this glut of really important novels and characters. But what is it about Dracula as a novel that has really kind of continued onwards to be as successful and spark as many story adaptations as it has?
Well, it's a great idea. all the stuff about vampire folklore and Vlad the Impaler that lots and lots of researchers have delved deep into and said, and I think Stoker didn't know that much about either of those things. I think he did the Wikipedia version of all those stuff. He knew enough, and he did what all good writers do. He found out enough that he needed for the story, and I think what he did was he wedded all this material, this formless floating around in the ether, to a story, to a character. And you can tell this because it's what Mary Shelley did with Frankenstein. It's what nobody has ever done for the Wolfman. Right? There is no classic werewolf novel in the way that Dracula or Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde, which I suppose is kind of a werewolf book, but in a way that those stories, that maybe the Phantom of the Opera has this as well. It's like it crystallizes all these ideas in one property that can then become a franchise.
I love it. Well, there you go. On that note, we're nearly out of time, Kim, but thank you so much for this. It's always such a joy to discuss horror with you, and just remind people if there's anything you've got coming up that people should keep a lookout for. You mentioned it's the 30th anniversary of Anno Dracula, right?
Yes, Titan, my publisher, are bringing out a truly lavish special edition, which I'm going to have to sign all the print run of, with a new introduction by Neil Gaiman, and as I say, an all new. It's 14,500 words of new story, which I can reveal is called Anno Dracula 1902, The Chances of Anything Coming from Mars.
Oh, amazing. And which ties in perfectly to the last time we chatted together on our Alien series.
Yeah, and everybody forgets that H.G. Wells' Martians are vampires too.
That's fantastic. I love that. Well, Kim, it's been such a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
A big thank you to the incredible Kim Newman. It's always a genuine honour to have him here on my podcast. All right, let's get straight into the second half of this week's episode as we discuss Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula in depth. Joining me to discuss all things Dracula, a very long-time friend of the pod. He is also a writer and director and actor, and he's the host of the Ghost Story Book Club podcast, in which he and his guests have deep dive discussions of written horror stories. So the absolute perfect guest to be here with me discussing this text. Welcome back to the podcast, Adam Robinson. Hello, Adam.
Hello, Mike. Thanks for having me back.
Hello. I'm very excited to have you here. Talking about such a classic, right? An intimidating classic.
Yeah, I know, right? And you've had Kim Newman on in the early part of this episode, who's, let's say the expert on Dracula. So, I feel...
Yeah, no pressure, Adam.
I know. Yeah.
Let me start off just by asking you, before we get into Dracula itself, just vampires in general, vampires in movies and literature and everything. Are you a fan of the vampire as a kind of movie monster, I suppose, as a horror monster?
I am. I find vampire films really fun, actually. It's weird because when we were talking about this series, not on the podcast, I couldn't quite bring to mind any movies that were like absolute favourites of mine. I struggle to think of anything that was in sort of my top 10 or anything like that. But I think they're really fun. It's a really fun genre. It's a genre that seems like it can be explored endlessly. And yet there's a coziness and a familiarity, isn't there, to the vampire? We sort of know what we're dealing with. And excitingly, when people mess about with that a bit, that makes their movie all the more unique and original and interesting. So I think, I really like going back to the vampire genre whenever it's on offer.
Yeah, I completely agree with you about that coziness and that familiarity. There is something so familiar about it. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, but this kind of innate knowledge of vampire mythology, vampire lore, and Dracula, it seems to just, it's like we're all born with it these days, So let's talk about Dracula, shall we? When did you first discover discover Dracula?
I mean, I read it in college as part of my A-level English literature, but I knew what Dracula was. I had a conception of Dracula before I had encountered any media whatsoever with Dracula in it. And I know this is something that you're already finding in this series of podcasts, but I think that's really interesting. So the one thing that I did have wrong, though, is that I thought that Dracula's fangs, I knew that he had big fangs, right? But I thought they were like down to his knees. There were drawings that I did when I was in school, and I remember this very distinctly, or maybe in nursery even, where I was drawing fangs like walrus.
Incredible. How impractical, you know? Like, can you imagine?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's not ideal, is it, if you want to be feasting on the necks of folks? But it's weird that, and even I was thinking about it as well. I even knew things like that he had something to do with like barrels of earth, and I knew that he disappeared into smoke when he was killed, and it was weird. I don't know whether I, at that age, sort of had conceived of him as a real figure in folklore or something rather than a literary character, but I think that's really interesting. And I was thinking about like my earliest encounters with Dracula, and I think it was through things like Duckula. Do you remember Duckula?
Absolutely. Duckula was how I think I discovered. I think it was Duckula and it was the Count from Sesame Street, and the combination of those two, right?
Yeah,
that give you that iconography of what Dracula is.
Absolutely. Duckula, and there's quite a bit of folklore in the sort of 30-second intro to Duckula that was and I used to love that. I was so obsessed with it as an idea, more even perhaps than the episodes.
The Counts of Dracula. Legend has it that these foul beings can be destroyed by a stake through the heart or exposure to sunlight. This does not suffice, however, for they may be brought back to life by means of a secret rite that can be performed once a century when the moon is in the 8th house of Aquarius.
Blood.
I'll get it! The latest reincarnation did not run according to plan.
In the heart of Transylvania, in the Vampire Hall of Fame, there's not a vampire there.
And then stuff like Abbott and Costello, I think that may have been my first encounter with the actual character of a version of Dracula. Mm-hmm. But so far as the novel's concerned, I didn't read that by choice, so to speak. I read it when I was at college, so it's not something that I found myself growing up, but it was something that was on a course that I was doing. But I loved. I mean, I properly loved it. We had this incredible English teacher called Dave Davies, not the Kinks guitarist, or indeed the Tory MP, and he was amazing. He was this extraordinarily passionate guy. He was so passionate about the Gothic. And I just, it's very hard, I think, when you have someone like that teaching you or leading, lessons, to not be totally infected by it. And I was. And I think I sort of owe Dave quite a lot, I think, in terms of my journey with the Gothic and horror. And one thing that it did, I think, is it sort of, I didn't realise that people were studying horror in that way and Gothic in that way. I just didn't know that until I got to my A-levels. And that was suddenly extremely exciting, because this genre that I loved growing up was kind of really into. I don't know, I suddenly thought, oh, okay, so people take it seriously. I take it seriously, but so do other people. And that was really quite exciting. Yeah,
I'm exactly the same. I first read it A-level English literature as well. And I know exactly what you mean, that idea of like, oh, so the horror texts can be taken seriously and academically, and it was the first time I unless you count something like Shakespeare's Macbeth, that I'd never really come across that kind of horror taken seriously at school at that point. And exactly the same as you, I think it's so fascinating that we all just seem to be born with a knowledge of Dracula, and who knows where that comes from. It would have been too early in my life for me to remember how I learnt who Dracula was.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably the same as you. It's probably Count Duckula. It's probably something like that. But yeah, I'm sure that by the time I came to actually reading the novel, I very much sort of knew what I was in for, whilst also maybe being quite surprised at what happens in the book and how different maybe it is to the general pop culture view of that story, I suppose.
Totally. And actually revisiting the novel for this conversation, I was really surprised by how horror laden some of those moments are in that book. Like I was like, wow,
Yes.
this is proper horror.
Yes.
It's not just kind of that romantic tiptoeing around it and everything's coded. It's like there's some real horrific moments and some really, really satisfying moments for horror fans, I think.
I agree. And this, again, it's like it's hard to kind of overstate just how important it is to every story that's come since, I think, right? Like from that really famous sort of first act, I suppose, that takes place in Transylvania, which almost every adaptation has, and even to that sort of final act where you've got this kind of almost Scooby gang of characters banding together to kill the vampire together, right? And every element of this story has something that so many other storytellers, filmmakers, whatever, have picked up on and run with over the years. It's amazing.
We're going to talk about it in detail, I suppose, but the whole portion, the Log of the Demeter, it's like a slasher movie. It's really the sort of blueprints of a slasher movie are right there in that log. I love that bit. It's one of my favorite bits. I'm sure we're going to come back to it later on. But I think you're right. I think the influence it's had is amazing, and even sort of certain set pieces. There's a moment where they discover a dog which has sort of had its throat torn away, and it's really graphic, it's really gory and kind of horrible, but it made me think of things like The Thing. It made me think of like Aliens 3 and it sounds really silly, but that sort of set piece of a killed dog, it really put me in mind of cinema that was to follow. And I'm not saying that the directors of those films had Dracula in mind, but I think that stuff goes in. If you read these texts, it goes in and it stays in, and it sort of comes out in other ways, I think.
I think you're so right. I think we'll talk about this, I'm sure, as we go, but there are so many moments of this novel, even the smaller, more incidental moments, that you feel like inspired some of the stuff that we know most famously now in the horror genre. So let me start off by asking you mentioned, the Gothic. You learned a bit about the Gothic when you were studying this book at school. Gothic is a term that we kind of all use and we sort of know what it means, but there is a kind of more of a specific definition to Gothic, isn't there? I mean, it does relate to a certain era, a certain style, a certain mode. Tell us a little bit about what Gothic actually means.
I mean, it is specific, but it's also extremely elastic, isn't it, the Gothic? And I think that this is something else I found very exciting when I was studying it. And actually, I had to look up some stuff about how to define the Gothic, because it's quite hard. Yeah. Like it's a mode, it's a tradition. It is a genre in and of itself, but it bleeds into lots of other things, like romantic literature, into horror itself, into we're exploring things that the romantic poets were looking at, like concept of the sublime and terror and things like that. So it's quite it's quite hard to define, or it's quite hard for me to define, let's put it that way. But it's the origin of the name is bound up with the architecture of the Middle Ages, and that was reflected in novels such as The Castle of Otranto, which is credited as the first Gothic novel, which is by Horace Walpole, and things like The Italian by Anne Radcliffe. But from that point it grew and developed, and actually the themes and things that were explored in those texts came to be the sort of characteristics of Gothic as it began to grow, essentially. So
actually, the origins of Gothic comes down to architecture, essentially. Like that's actually what that sort of initially meant. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially. But before that, you also had the Goths, which were, I believe, a Germanic group, and that was before the architecture. And
right,
it's this is what I mean. It's a genre and it's a definition which has grown and has expanded and is now, I think, quite an elastic thing. So you can spot Gothic. Like I remember reading The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks and being told that was a Gothic novel, and at the time I was like, I don't really understand what you mean. I don't get it. But of course, it is bound up with the idea of transgression and fear and disgust and, you know, pushing at the boundaries of what we might consider to be socially acceptable, and all those things that you find in Dracula, in, you know, I guess even in the Castle of Otranto, as back as far as that novel. So it, you know, you find Gothic in all kinds of places that perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily say, well, that's a Gothic text. And I find that, again, when I was studying this, I just found that so interesting and so exciting that this genre that kind of contained all of the things that I found really interesting was also massively expansive.
Yes. It's really fascinating, I think. And I suppose when you read about that, what that architecture is like, Gothic architecture, it kind of then feeds into all of those stories that we know from that era, right? But if you look up like the really basic, like the Wikipedia definition of like Gothic architecture, it's like pointed arches, stained glass, vaults, right? That kind of thing, towers and spires, and you know, so you're thinking of those old big cathedral-like structures, and, you know, that kind of thing.
But again, I mean, that was perhaps a cornerstone of early Gothic texts, but you know, it's the themic similarities, I think, that carried it through. So, you know, it deals with the supernatural, of course. It deals with a sense of dread, mystery, suspense, you know, that kind of thing. And you do have tropes like the old haunted castle, but in many Gothic texts, you know, we don't see that architectural element,
right?
And you know, it's interested in exploring lots of the things that we're interested in horror. You know, terror, and the differences between terror and horror, I think, is something that the Gothic is bound up with. So Anne Radcliffe believed that terror and horror weren't neighbours; they were opposites almost.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
What are the differences then between terror and horror?
Well, for Anne Radcliffe, and there's lots of scholarly conversation about the differences between terror and horror. But for Anne Radcliffe, she said that terror expanded the soul and awakened the faculties to a high degree of life. So it's almost like a life-affirming experience. It's bound up with the senses. It's bound up with a sensory experience. And she said that horror, and this is a quote, contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates the senses. So in actual fact, you can see how she's talking. You know, I think people use terror and horror as synonyms, but for Radcliffe, they weren't synonyms. They were really two completely different experiences. One can take quite a positive view of an experience where we're subject to terror, but not with horror. It's bound up with disgust and kind of, I guess, something more bodily, something more all-consuming and unpleasant.
Wow, that is really fascinating. And where does Dracula lie then, in your opinion, going by that definition?
I think there's so much horror in Dracula. There's so much about the body. I mean, I was even sort of reminded as I was compiling my notes of little tiny details about how Dracula has rank breath, I think it says at one point. And it's just stuff like that. There's so much of the body in this. There's so much of horror relating to the body and blood and, you know, violent acts on the body. But then, I don't know, maybe, you know, when we're dealing with, particularly in the early chapters where Harker's travelling through to Transylvania, I think there's plenty of moments of terror in that, you know, with these encounters with the superstitious villagers. Even weird moments like these blue lights that he sees.
Yes,
that
the blue light bit is very strange.
It's a bit odd, isn't it? I don't even think it's... I mean, there's a moment where he talks about it. It's supposed to mark buried treasure or something like that.
That's right, yeah.
But I don't fully... I don't know whether I just didn't pay attention to that bit. I don't, but so I think it's a good mix. But for me, the resounding feeling that I get if we're going by those two definitions is horror, really.
Mm-hmm. How does Dracula compare for you to some of the other great, you know, regarded sort of Gothic texts, I suppose, you know, like Dorian Gray or Jekyll and Hyde or Rebecca or those kind of things? You know, does Dracula for you kind of sit firmly in with those other ones?
I think it does. I don't think it's, as I've realised this time round, I don't think it's quite as readable as lots of the things that you've just listed. So Jekyll and Hyde, Jane Eyre, Dorian Gray, and Rebecca. I'm really glad that you brought Rebecca up. I love that. I love Rebecca so much.
So good.
I think they're very, very readable. I think lots of Dracula is readable and enjoyable and thrilling, actually. The first half of Dracula, I think, is so thrilling to read. But it really hits a sort of slow patch which doesn't really let up until the end. So in that sense, I don't find it quite as enjoyable as a book to read for pleasure as lots of those other texts. But you know, it with all of them, there's this interest, again, this Gothic preoccupation with death, particularly this Victorian interest in death. You know, which I think is. You can quite understand it when you think, you know, there's a monarch on the throne who's been in mourning for many, many years. The Victorian interest in funeral traditions, many of which, you know, are still observed and practiced even now. You've got photography emerging and being used for post-mortem portraits of lost loved ones, because of course, you know, people wouldn't snap photos the way that we do now, of course. So often the only picture that people might have of a loved one is actually after they died, which seems really morbid to us, but you can kind of understand that desire to preserve their memory in that way, I suppose, can't you? But yeah, I mean, it deals with mortality. It's interested in legacy and death, what happens after death, and I think in the same way that lots of those texts do. I think it has this really ornate style, which feels like a characteristic of the Gothic, which almost, you know, if we're going to expand the metaphor, almost is reflective of that architecture that we were talking about earlier. And I guess it even maybe you could even say it echoes these these quite flamboyant mourning rituals in some ways. So it definitely fits in there. You read it and you realise you're very firmly in that Gothic tradition, I think. But it's interesting to me how it has survived and been celebrated way more than the vast majority of those other texts. I find that really interesting.
I do as well, and you know, there's probably there's many reasons you could argue maybe as to why this novel has prevailed so much over some of the others. But I wonder if one of the most important reasons is Dracula himself, right?
Yeah, totally.
But again, I kind of forget until I reread it how little Dracula is actually in this story.
He's hardly in it. Yeah, he's in it. He's in it loads at the beginning, like right at the beginning.
Yes, and that beginning section is the section that sort of everyone knows the most, right? Because it's the section that is always shown in all the adaptations, the Transylvania and all of that.
If you pick up Dracula and start reading it, you'll immediately think, oh yeah, I know this, I'm familiar with this. This is but it's so interesting. I had completely forgotten that as well. In fact, I think I must have picked the book up. I've got a really lovely hardback edition of the book, and I must have, when I bought it, or when it was bought for me a few years ago, I must have picked it up and just started reading, and my bookmark was still in the bit where Harker's in the castle, so I didn't get very far. But on revisiting this time, I was really I was reminded again of how I know where we are. We're in Dracula's castle, and it's all the classic lines that I remember, and the 3 vampire women, I remember that set piece. And the driver, is the driver Dracula, or is it a different person? It's probably.
I think one of the most chilling images is that image of Dracula like crawling up the wall or crawling down the wall, right?
Like a lizard.
Like a lizard. That's such a great moment that I always feel like hasn't been used in as many adaptations as it could be. Like, I think it's such a cool, creepy image.
You know what? I sometimes conflate what I've read in the book with Francis Ford Coppola's
Yes, I
film.
think it is in the. I think
Is
it
it
is in the
in there?
Coppola one. I think it is.
Yeah, it says. Yeah. I mean, I've got the quote here.
Yeah.
And it says, "My feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings." And it's that first hint, I think, of the bat-like, or the bat, the transformation into the bat. I agree with you. I'm always struck by that, and I always remember it because it's so weird. It's got that lovely uncanniness about it, hasn't it? That we recognize it as a man, but also he's moving like a lizard. So it's that which should be but isn't, and that which shouldn't be but is.
Yes, exactly that. It's so full of these kind of moments, isn't it? I'm going to come back to Dracula as a character in just a moment, but I want to start off by asking you your thoughts on just the style in which this is written. Obviously, this is an epistolary novel, which means that it obviously consists entirely of diary entries, journal entries, newspapers. It's all kind of, I guess, first-person accounts, right, from various different people, and it's like a collage of all these entries put together to tell the story. What do you think of that style, and what does it add to you for this story?
I think it's great. I mean, I'm always put in mind of found footage when I read it, which I don't think is an original point to be making, but I think I was struck a lot by that this time, particularly in that first half of the book, I would say, the first, maybe even into 2/3, that chopping and changing between one perspective and another perspective. It really put me in mind of found footage, and actually some of the better examples of found footage. That it really gave me that same sensation of sort of peering over the shoulder, I think. But I think in terms of the way that the book works, it's interesting to me. This sort of fragmentary nature is interesting because we're not necessarily invited to make cast iron judgments about each character sort of as we're reading it. They present their recollections and everything that they've encountered, and we sort of end up being able to reach our own conclusions. And I think reading in a contemporary setting, reading in 2022, it's interesting, and I wonder what our conclusions about these characters are, when we might consider what our Victorian ancestors might have made of these characters. And I think that's really interesting because there's not a lot of I'm going to say something which maybe people will disagree with, but I felt like I was able to draw my own conclusions about these characters and sort of go, I don't really like you, or actually what you're doing isn't, it doesn't feel it doesn't feel very nice what you're doing, and I think that's interesting because if it was an omniscient narrator, we might be more led by the hand in that sense. I also think it's interesting because in the same way that the best of M.R. James works, we're being asked to be detective to a certain extent. Some of the better stuff in Dracula, I think, is when nobody's really sure what on earth is going on.
Yes, 100%.
And we're more sure because we have the context of the other documents. So if you consider that whole bit in Whitby where you've got Mina's accounts of what's going on with Lucy, and then you've also got these great stuff about the Demeter and this kind of ship that ends up wrecked on the rocks, it's so scary and so strange. And I guess because we know what Dracula is, I don't say it's spoiled somewhat, but we know what's happening loosely.
Yeah.
But I think that's the most exciting stuff where it's a bunch of characters who are saying this weird thing happened today.
Yes.
This
agreed.
horrible thing happened today. And you sort of having to pick through it and go, okay, so how is Renfield related to this ship that's coming from Varna to Whitby? Like what you're sort of piecing it together. And even though I'm really familiar with Dracula, and I'm quite familiar with the book. I wouldn't say I'm a cast iron expert on this novel, but I was even with my knowledge and sort of knowing what I know about this novel, I was still playing detective a bit and still thinking, how does that relate to this? And
Yeah, I love that too. There is a feeling of, I guess it does add a kind of sense of unreliability. Like we, you know, all these different subjective viewpoints essentially that we're jumping from, that are all coming to everything with their own context and their own knowledge and whatever, or lack of knowledge.
I think we're even
that's
told
really interesting.
We're even told a couple of times, aren't we, that this nothing here is objective. I think at some point,
yes, nothing here is to be trusted. Almost, you know,
which is weird.
Yeah, that's really nice. It's weird, and it reminded me of when we've talked about M.R. James together on your podcast, and that idea of these stories being like told through a friend of a friend of a friend, like these kind of weird. You know, we're very distanced from these stories, and therefore what really happened kind of thing.
Totally.
You know, I think there is that element of it. And it's kind of clever that there is this kind of almost meta-narrative too, that like found footage, you're kind of assuming that somebody has assembled these entries for you to read them, right? Even in the world of the story, there's this. There are mentions of it towards the end, aren't there? But this idea of like putting together these various bits and pieces and eyewitness accounts in order to tell the story of what happened, and that's all quite interesting.
I think it's so interesting, and you know, I think the novel's at its strongest when it's exploring that to the fullest, really. So I think, you know, when we're not spending too long with one character, it is for me when it's at its best, and when we're having to find a path through that. I think it starts to, I don't know, it was harder work when you get to this bit where when it sort of moves away from that that verisimilitude, I suppose, of brief notes, diary entries, letters, and becomes really expansive and explanatory. Is explanatory a word?
Well, yeah, I think that there is a moment when you almost forget that you're reading like diary entries or whatever, where suddenly it feels like it becomes normal. You know, kind of omniscient narrator, like you say, like a kind of normal prose almost, you know, with and that's really interesting. And I think the other thing that is, I guess you forget if you're less familiar with the book and more familiar with all the adaptations, is that so much of it is told through the point of view of quite periphery characters, I think, too. Like, you'd remember from knowing the adaptations, you know, obviously everyone remembers Dracula, Jonathan, Mina and Lucy. Some of these other characters, like Dr. Seward, right, who I maybe has the most kind of to say and the most input in this book out of everyone, right? But he's more of a sort of onlooker to a lot of it.
He's not. Yeah, I totally agree. And he's not. I think I can't. I'm trying to think of is he in Francis Ford Coppola's version? I think maybe
it's what's his name? It's with Nail.
It's Richard E. Grant.
Richard E. Grant.
Of course it is, And isn't Tom Waits Renfield? I think.
Yes.
Oh my goodness, I love Tom Waits.
Brilliant.
But yeah, you're right, and he does have a lot to say, and he becomes quite very central as time moves on. We understand particularly the proximity of I think it's called an asylum, isn't it, in the book? I'm not wrong if I call it that in this. Obviously, we wouldn't call it that today. But I think one of the things I do quite like about Dr. Seward is when there's an emergency and he's signing off, and it takes him ages to finish his paragraph, and it's like get out, go. There's a problem. Go. He's
yeah. The one thing I will say about this novel, rereading it, there's so much to love. Obviously, it's an incredible book, and I think the level of detail is phenomenal at sort of world building, you know, all of these different characters, these different locations, and it spends so much time building that world and that atmosphere. But also, it's pretty long, and there are huge sections of this with people explaining things to people or whatever, and I think at times it is a bit longer and wordier than it needs to be, you know?
It is, yeah. I know it feels like you're really treading on, like, you know, horror royalty by even suggesting this, but I think I wonder what it would be like with an edit or two. I don't know. I mean, the other thing is that I don't know, is there an attention span thing? Is there a sort of 21st century attention span thing? You know, it competes with so much of the stuff that we want slightly... I don't know.
But then again, like you've said, and actually like Kim Newman said, and I think that Kim Newman said it makes it okay for us to say this, right? But it is a bit of a slog at times. I think Kim described it as being a bit creaky and sprawling, and, you know, and it isn't as easy a read as, you know, Jekyll and Hyde or even Dorian Gray. And so I don't think it's just across that, we're in a different century now. I think it is a bit flabby at times, it does kind of, again, I think, like you said, it's particularly in that second half, or even just final third.
There's lots of explaining at certain moments, particularly Van Helsing. There's just lots of explaining and theorizing, and that becomes a bit of a drag at certain points. You're just like, look, we get it, but I don't know. I'm trying to rush to its defense at the same time as criticizing. Yeah. Because also, I wonder, again, this stuff about, there's a lot of vampire folklore, a lot of explaining and then re-explaining what Dracula is capable of, what he's able to do at certain points, which actually is different. I mean, coming away from it this time, I was like, what? So he can move in the daytime, he's just reduced in his power. Is that right?
Yes.
There were bits I was like, oh, is that...
Yeah, like one of the really interesting things that I completely forgot about that Kim Newman pointed out, that I think it wasn't until Nosferatu, a kind of unofficial adaptation of Dracula, but one that very much told its own story.
Yeah.
Nosferatu, Count Orlok is killed by the curtain opening and he disappears.
Yes.
And that was the first text to do that, to have daylight killing the vampire.
Yeah.
Because you're right, it's not really part of this Dracula.
No. He's just sluggish in the daytime.
Sluggish, yeah.
He just
We've all been there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when the light comes through the curtains after certain fantastic nights out, and you're like, oh no.
Oh no.
But the other thing that I found interesting, really leaping to the end of the novel, is that this perception, if you asked, most people, how do they thwart Dracula? How do they kill him ultimately in the book? How, most people I would imagine would say either that, the light kills him, or that he has a stake through the heart, but he doesn't. Yeah. It's he's killed with a knife to the throat and stabbed in the heart as well, but not by, he's not staked.
Not staked. Yeah.
And I think that's interesting, it's worth reading Dracula to go to those moments where you think you know what that is, where you've seen it in maybe 20 films, or you've got a conception of how a certain scene plays out. It's really worth going back to it and reading it or rereading it. And I really enjoyed that process of going, oh, actually, that's different from how I remembered it. It's different from how I had it in my head.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree with you, completely agree with you. I think it's really interesting to go back to, given what Dracula ended up kind of being responsible for, like an entire genre, basically, and what's happened to that sort of story and character since.
Yeah.
Speaking of, let's talk about Dracula himself then, and again, how different or similar is Dracula in this novel as a character to the Dracula maybe that people know of if they think of Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee or somebody like that?
I think quite different.
Yeah.
I think this slick hair, kind of, high collar aristocrat that became, this blueprint for things like Dracula, for things like the Munsters. Is it the granddad in the Munsters?
Yeah.
This, if you were asked to draw Dracula, or even like the emoji for the vampire, I realised when I did a little tweet about your podcast today.
Exactly. It's so iconic that it's an emoji.
Yeah. Exactly. But no, he's not like that at all. He has a moustache, and he's described. I think an aquiline nose is a word that is the expression that is used, and he's an old man, and we get this long white moustache. When he regains youth through feeding on people, the moustache remains, and it becomes iron grey. And I think perhaps even becoming darker than that when he's at his most youthful. I guess the closest we've had is indeed Francis Ford Coppola's, where you've got Gary Oldman.
Yeah.
I guess that's the closest.
I think out of the big mainstream ones, I think that's true. I mean, they sort of did something like that with Claes Bang, right? With Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat's, like, he sort of, he got younger and more attractive as it went on.
Yeah. But that, he reverts to that Bela Lugosi archetype to a certain extent, doesn't he? I mean,
he does.
He looks like a Dracula.
He does. He looks like a Dracula. Exactly. You're so right. And I think, and there's like, I spent a lot of time last week talking with like Kevin and Mary about how the vampire is sexy and alluring.
Yeah.
But actually, is he that sexy and alluring in this? Like, he's quite, like you said earlier, they talk about his kind of rank breath. They talk like, I feel like, I don't think even, you know, throughout he's particularly described as being, like, he's quite charming and erudite maybe, but not particularly physically attractive.
Exactly.
You know?
And I'm always reminded of that scene in... I sound like such a fanboy of the Francis Ford Coppola one, but because it's the closest to the novel, it's the one that I keep going back to, or one of the closest anyway.
Yeah.
The scene where it's Mina and Dracula, and I think he's wearing like a red shirt or something. It's a long time since I've watched it, but it's very much a sort of... a romantic scene. You know, it's obviously dealing with transgression and stuff, but it's a romantic scene in that movie. And Mina is completely entranced and even we could say attracted to the character of Dracula in that. But in this one, when you sort of get the equivalent of that scene, it's described that he's sort of pushing her face into the wound that he's made on himself. And I think it talks about like the way a cat would encourage a kitten to drink milk or something like that. It's really grim.
Gross.
It's a great description. Yeah, it's horrible, but it's a really great description. But I think it's a supernatural thing that's going on with Dracula in the novel. I agree with you. I was looking for that sort of sense of attraction, but I think it's something that isn't possible to resist, perhaps. In
it's more, like you say, it's more supernatural. It's more that kind of glamoring almost, or hypnotizing, or whatever, isn't it? That I guess a lot of vampires in pop culture still have that, but I think it's very much that kind of thing in the novel, isn't it?
But I mean, maybe it's a sort of maybe it's the things that he's offering that are in that, you know, forbidden way, particularly for a Victorian audience, the things that make him attractive in inverted commas. You know, what's he offering? He's offering eternal life of the body, you know, in exchange for death of the soul. It's like it's the inversion of Christ, isn't it? In that sense, you know. But he's also offering, you know, a coded sexual liberation, polygamy. You know, he's offering all these things, and you know, I guess an opportunity to turn you back on religious teachings is the other thing that he's offering. So, I don't know. It's dangerous. It is intoxicating in that sense, isn't it? Because it's that, and it is classic Gothic, exploring those areas that ought to repel, and perhaps even, you know, develop in us a sense of disgust, but are at the same time quite alluring, quite attractive.
Yeah, 100%. And as well as that sexual element, there's always been, I think, you know, even in some of the adaptations, you think recently of the Mark Gatiss adaptation, there's been a homoerotic element too, you know, between Jonathan and Dracula and then elsewhere. But do you see any of that in the novel? Is any of that there for you when rereading it?
I mean, I think it's there, isn't it? I think the one of the brilliant things about this novel is how much there is, and how much we can go back and revisit and find these topics and elements for ourselves. Yeah, I mean, I was reading, and I can't remember where it is, so I apologise that I can't give my source, but I was reading that the American version of Dracula, when it was published, the novel, the bit where Dracula is accused by the three vampire women of not being able to love. Yes. Around about that point, he says in the American version something like, "Tonight he is mine, tomorrow he will be yours," or something like that.
That's right.
So that, I mean, that is absolutely laden, isn't it? With homoeroticism, you could argue.
Yeah, it's absolutely that scene, isn't it? And that scene is, again, you get that subtext in a lot of the film adaptations, that he's mine kind of moment. Yeah. I think so. So I think it absolutely is there for us to read. And I think I really feel with Dracula that there's a lot in there that Stoker may have been surprised that we
or any audience finds in there. That's not to say that it's not absolutely there and legitimately there, and because it is. I try to subscribe to this idea of the death of the author in that sense, and we find what we can find. But I find Dracula so interesting because of that. That's one of the reasons I think it has endured, actually.
Yeah, 100%. There's so much to it, I suppose. Like we've said, there are so many characters, so many strange little diversions and that kind of thing. And I wonder if that's partly what has kept it alive and what's kept inspiring storytellers, because there's so much in there that you almost forget about, and that packed in. Yeah. So let me just ask you briefly about that setup in that first sort of section as well in Transylvania. The other thing that I guess the novel is rightly accused of, right, is that there is maybe a feeling of xenophobia to this as well, right? That there is very much this sense of otherness, I suppose, Jonathan arriving in Transylvania and, like you say, kind of meeting the Transylvanians, then, meeting Dracula and everything else. Again, whether, I mean, probably not deliberately, but that, it brings to mind, again, the kind of exploitation type folk horror-y, or even Eli Roth's Hostel movies, like, don't go to Eastern Europe, here's what's going to happen to you kind of thing. It's like that. That's a very well-worn trope, isn't it? But that's all there as well. It's
and again, it carries through into ghost stories, which is, my area of expertise to a certain extent. That sort of the expert, the figure of the expert being not necessarily somebody who is qualified in XYZ or professor of this or or somebody at the top of their game in that. An expert in that sense, in the Gothic sense, is just somebody who knows some stuff about something that the protagonist doesn't know. And you have loads of experts. You have lots of people offering Jonathan Harker a crucifix and sort of saying, and crossing themselves and offering blessings and things like that. And there is definitely a sense of him looking down his nose on it, or certainly being patronising about it, isn't there? And it's very, very present in the novel that even things like the trains become less reliable the further east he goes. He's very patronising about the food that they give him, which sounds quite nice. That paprika dish sounds really good. And Mina, we find out later, can't abide garlic, so I'm not going for dinner at the Harker's house.
What's wrong with these people?
But yeah, I think it's definitely there. I mean, what I find really interesting about the novel is, there's this sense of science, rationality, technology. It absolutely permeates the novel. It's everywhere. Yes. You've got all these gadgets and gizmos. You've got the phonograph, you've got the typewriter, the sort of modern typewriter.
That's right. Yeah, the sort of travel typewriter.
The travel typewriter. You've got the blood transfusion. So it's all in there in terms of it being this contemporary novel about, look at the English, how civilized they are, and how their technology is so far advanced, and even sort of like considerations of psychology and stuff like that are in there with Seward's character. But the things that thwart Dracula are bound up with superstition and folklore. That is how they defeat him. They don't defeat him with these modern gadgets. And even things like Quincy's got Winchester rifles, I think, hasn't they? Are they rifles? Yes. Winchester guns, anyway.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And they're not the things that defeat him. The things that defeat him are a knowledge of superstition and putting into practice and making part of the plot all of those things that perhaps early doors Harker was, laughing about, and not laughing about, being derisory about, I suppose. And I think that's really interesting. So what are we being invited to consider? I don't know. This setup, as patronising and as xenophobic as it seems, in fact, towards the end, it's if we'd followed that knowledge in the first place and listened to that advice in the first place, the characters wouldn't have ended up necessarily in the situations that they end up in. I'm not suggesting for a second that Stoker's sort of saying, "Haha," these people were indeed the heroes, because I don't think that's how they're positioned. but it's interesting.
It is
to consider.
It is. It goes back to what you were saying about this idea of us being sort of reading from the perspective of these kind of slightly pompous English people all the way through, right? But it's not necessarily saying that everything they're saying is correct, that their opinions are the opinions that we should agree with or whatever else, and that's all really interesting, I think. And you're right, and it's something that's carried through vampire movies, no matter whether or not they're set in the past or the present, there is always this idea that it comes down to these old ways of killing vampires.
Exactly.
Buffy doesn't use a gun, she has to use a wooden stake and holy water, and like there is always this feeling like it always goes back to the old folklore, the myths, that kind of thing. It's great. Yeah, I
think so. And again, reading it with contemporary eyes, I think we can't know what the experience of reading it as a Victorian would have been, on a personal level, but reading it with contemporary eyes, I think there are ways to read that novel which perhaps change what we might imagine the author's intention to be. If that makes sense.
It's such a good point. Tell me about those characters then. Other than Dracula, we've got this other big ensemble of people. Jonathan, Lucy, Mina, the other three, Renfield, all of this.
the other
three blokes, who I'm talking about.
The suitors.
And,
the one who changes his name halfway through and it's really confusing.
Oh, that's really confusing.
It's Arthur Holmwood and then Lord Godalming, isn't it? I think doesn't Arthur become Lord Godalming? Is that right?
Yes. So there's Arthur that is Godalming, who is married to
Correct.
Lucy, right? There's Quincy Morris, Quincy Morris, and then Jack Seward.
Yeah.
Yes. Quincy's the American, right?
Quincy's American. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got all of these other characters and various other kind of peripheral characters as well. What are your thoughts on them generally? You said, reading it again, some of them you didn't necessarily like.
Yeah.
Who did you like? Who didn't you like?
Well, it's really easy, I think, to like Mina on the whole. I think she's one of the most interesting characters in the whole thing. It's really interesting to me that she has quite a lot of agency and leads quite a lot of what's going on, and is absolutely instrumental in Dracula's demise, like absolutely, to the point where obviously she becomes psychically connected to him, and he's telling... Are they referred to as the Band of Light, I think, sometimes? I'm sure I've read that, or the Army of Light. I don't know. Anyway, the other lot, the men. She is able to lead them through that whole thing. So I really enjoyed the parts where it was Mina's journal. I think she comes across really well. There are a few moments where contemporary attitudes creep in, and you end up doing quite a lot of eye rolling and being like, oh my goodness.
Well, my partner Rihanna hates Dracula. She finds the story, the book, absolutely insufferable.
Yeah, I can understand.
And she talked about this on a Patreon episode recently, and we got a lot of comments being like, how the fuck could you hate Dracula? But I know what she means, especially rereading it. Like the male characters and their attitude towards the female characters does get a bit exhausting as it goes
really
on.
Does. And even like things like, and this is why like Van Helsing just comes across awfully, I think, for on a contemporary reading, when he starts whenever she does anything brilliant in the sort of latter half of the book, he starts talking about her having a man's brain. Yeah, it's like it's just so unnecessary, so offensive, and it's just like, really, why? And it's perhaps worse because he seems to think of it as a compliment. It's really patronising and horrible. But it's interesting, isn't it, that at the same time as that stuff is going on, Stoker does position Mina, and again, it's really not perfect at all. There are lots of problems with the depiction, but he does position her as this really smart person who is leading a lot of the action, who is interested in technology, who is using technology better than almost everybody, who, thanks to her organization, even stuff like down to like plotting train timetables and stuff. She comes across.
There's a lot of train timetables to chat.
Aren't they? Imagine having like you couldn't get one; you had to write it down. But I'm really, really, really not defending Stoker's portrayal of women in this novel. I'm not, but I'm saying that it's interesting. I think that it's not. It doesn't just have that one beat of that patronising attitude that you just alluded to from Jonathan. That doesn't endure in everything.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's not, I think that's what's so interesting about this novel. It's so textured. We have got these different characters with these different backgrounds, these different perspectives. Some of them we can like, some of them we really dislike. And maybe that is different to the desired effect when it was first published in 1897. But I think what makes it so interesting even reading today is that we can still look at these characters and believe them, even if we don't necessarily like them, right?
I think, and Lucy, I mean, if we think about Lucy, when she talks about wishing to have 3 husbands, I think there were just some really, for the time, some really bold propositions. And again, I mean, obviously, then we have to consider the fact that Lucy is then punished in that horror way by first becoming undead and this liberated character, this sort of sexually liberated character when she's on her way to being a vampire. And then of course the ultimate punishment is this really, really horrible staking scene which happens after she dies, or after she becomes undead, so to speak. So it's hard, isn't it? Because there were moments in the early parts where I was, particularly Mina and Lucy's letters, which I really enjoyed that back and forth between them. I was thinking to myself, some of this is on its way to being quite interesting in that political sense.
Some of it was quite ahead of its time, I think, isn't it? And I think you're right, and a lot of it really is, and it's not as if some of those tropes have even gone away now. That idea of that this sexually liberated woman, it being the first to die in a horror story, right? I mean, that's still a thing.
And also, with I don't know. A bunch of men making decisions about what happens to a woman's body is in Dracula, and you sort of think, well, how far have we come? Since then, it's quite alarming in that sense.
And what about Van Helsing? What are your thoughts on him then? Because again, I guess he's a character that's kind of almost become as famous. As Dracula himself, in a way, right? Yeah. But he's an interesting character.
He's interesting. He's weird, and I don't really like him. So that's my analysis. He's very cagey when he knows all this stuff right at the start, and he's doing lots of stuff and asking people's faith in him for a long time. And I find myself yelling at the pages, just tell them what's happening. At the start, stop disappearing off to Amsterdam to do that. Just tell them what's going on. That annoyed me about him. There's a smugness about that character. The other thing is these moments where he bursts into laughter and stuff, and has these really dark and weird little jokes to himself, and then breaks into almost hysterical laughter. That's weird. And and all the way through, I was just thinking, what are we being invited to think, or what can we consider about this character? Because again, maybe in the Victorian reading would be that Van Helsing is the hero, or very much one of the heroes of this book. But reading from a contemporary perspective, he doesn't really stand for any sense of liberation. He stands for control. He stands for conservatism to a certain extent. Yes, he's a man of knowledge and science, but he's very dismissive of certain areas. He's very dismissive, so far as I remember, about things like mesmerism, but really on board with hypnosis. And there's a lot of contradictions, I think, in Van Helsing.
It's true.
And I think you could very easily read him and read him as a villainous, patriarchal character, I think, in a more modern reading of the book. I just found that he went on a bit too much, a bit like I'm doing now. But
no, it's true though. That was the part I found the most difficult to get through, where it's just Van Helsing explaining to everyone what's going on, and not explaining it in a very useful, direct way initially as well. But yeah, I guess, it's easy for us to kind of grumble at that now with all of our knowledge of vampire mythology and vampire lore. But I guess at the time that wasn't the case. We needed those explanations laid out. But yeah, it is a lot of Van Helsing explaining things.
There's a lot of good stuff in that, like the folklore when he's going into the folklore. Some of that I think is really interesting, and some of the history of Dracula I think is really interesting, and about actually. He brings to light in some of that discussion one of the conflicts of Dracula, which is that he was a good, overall a good person at certain points of it when he was alive, and did very many heroic things and was very celebrated. And I think that's interesting because we don't often, don't know. I mean, again. Coming back to my favourite film of all time, Francis Ford Coppola's version, there is a bit of that in that. There is a reflection of him being a noble, heroic leader and all that. So some of it's quite good, but I think when we're going over it time and time again, I just think but again, maybe I don't know. And again, I don't know whether that's deliberate in terms of the character. Are we supposed to find him quite smug?
That's it. And sometimes there is a bit of again, it's not great, and it's a little bit xenophobic again, but there is a little, feels like a tendency to maybe want to laugh at him a little bit as well as like the foreign man who talks funny.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I read something, again, I can't remember exactly where I read this, but I'm sure I read something that it explains that his command over English actually deteriораtes as the book goes on.
Right.
And I noticed that as I was
It did seem
reading.
like that, actually. It did seem like that. Like, I was... it didn't feel like initially when you first hear from him, it is quite as extreme as it is later on down the line.
And it just becomes really quite hard to stay with, I think, some of those chapters. It's like... It's quite... you trip over a lot of it because it's very broken English, so to speak.
Yes. I flip-flopped between reading the book and listening to the audiobook. And it was great, actually. I'd recommend when you get to that section, just listen to, Tim Curry, do some of those bits. It's great. But
there is a Tim Curry one on Audible, right?
Yeah. Tim Curry and what's his name? Alan Cumming as well. It does a lot of it because he plays Seward. It's good. It's a really good audiobook. I'd recommend it. It's great. But yes, it is. You're right. Like it makes that trickier to read. Yeah. It makes it a bit more of a slog. Yeah.
And again, I should perhaps be answering rather than asking this question as you've asked me on as this guest. But what we invited to think about that. I don't know.
I think it goes back to that idea, like what you were saying about how those Hungarian people at the beginning were, maybe a bit weird, quote unquote, but actually ultimately they were right and they knew what they were doing. And it's this idea of this other man coming from this other place, and he knows more. He knows about the folklore. He knows about the old weird supernatural stuff because it's not something that, quote unquote, civilized people in England know about. Almost, I don't know. I feel like there's something almost about that,
like a move away from Englishness somehow in order to.
We've got to get another outsider in order to save us from this outsider.
That's really interesting. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and as for the others, I mean, Jonathan, I think is. I don't know. It's very sort of buttoned up English man, isn't he? And doesn't really. I mean, goes through this traumatic experience, and actually some of the more interesting stuff, or some of the really interesting stuff, is when he's recovering in that hospital run by the nuns.
Sister Agatha.
Yeah, which is obviously brought into Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat's version, and. Yeah, and I think we see elements of his character there, and again, it's that brilliant thing of what we know as readers, that dramatic irony thing. We know it because we've read his account, but Mina doesn't know why he's been affected in this way. Mm-hmm. So that I think is quite interesting.
Renfield's a great character, right? As well, like great, really interesting character, and in basically every adaptation as well. Like you feel like he's a fun character to play because he's written. He's fun. He's a fun character to read, I think, off the page as well, isn't he? Because he's so mad, I suppose, quote unquote, as they call him.
This is it. I mean, this is it. It's not. Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Because it's not you'd even find today more sloppy and lazy depictions of mental illness than in Renfield, because he's not, he's not always on one beat, is he? He's not constantly behaving in a way that, to use the word that is in there, quote unquote, mad, or insane, or whatever else is used in the novel. He's not, a lot of the time he speaks very eloquently in a very refined way. He has a position on things. He seems to have or want to have some agency over what he's doing. I'm not suggesting that this is a very sensitive portrayal of we're told that he's zoophagous, right? That's the thing that Seward categorizes him as. But yeah, I think, he seems to have a lot to do in the novel. He seems to not be completely easy to fathom. So at some point you think, well, he's definitely up for being Dracula's servant, familiar, whatever. Yeah. But then at times he seems really frightened. He has these moments of like lucid fear, and he's like, actually, don't leave me in here because he's gonna get me.
That's all really interesting, I think.
I think it is. Yeah. And there's something interesting going on in Renfield, which I think you can probably expand out for the whole novel, which is this idea of labeling him. So as soon as Seward is able to label him as zoophagous, I think is the expression he uses, isn't it? Eater of animals, I suppose. Yeah. I guess that's what that means.
Yes, I would imagine so.
Imagine so. He becomes that bit more easy to manage. It's the thing that Seward is looking for. It's that label. And I think actually in Dracula something interesting happens with labeling. So as soon as Dracula is named as a vampire, a couple of things happen. Firstly, in the text, he becomes manageable in terms of being a villain. So we know what to do with a vampire. We didn't know what to do with this dark figure leaning over Lucy in Whitby, this wolf, this dog that leaps from the boat, this strange count. We didn't know what to do with that, but we do know what to do with a vampire, so he becomes manageable. But actually, for me, when I'm reading this, he becomes less interesting and he becomes less threatening. Yeah. And it's really interesting. You can kind of expand that out to lots of vampire fiction, lots of vampire movies. As soon as we know that we're dealing with a vampire movie, we sort of know what we've got, and it becomes less threatening. And I think that's an interesting thing within. It's right there in the novel. It's all about, we're going to name this thing, we're going to categorize it. If you will pardon the pun, we're going to put it in a box.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you're so true. You're so right. And that all comes with that group of characters, these academics and all of these types of people that are all trying to get a grasp and control, I suppose, what's going on. That's a really interesting point. Yeah, it's so true. Let's start talking about some of our favorite just moments, I suppose, and horror moments. I mean, there are so many, like you said. There's actually a lot of really creepy horror in this, isn't there? From the weird baby in the bag that gets fed to the wives, and the obviously everything that happens on the ship, like you say, and then Lucy, the boofer lady stuff with the kids, I think is really creepy.
One of the best things about the boofer lady thing, right, is that nobody seems to be in agreement for what the bloofer lady really means. Like, I've read it means beautiful.
Beautiful, yes, that's what I assumed it was. I think from having read something,
it just feels so close to something like the Boogeyman.
Yes, and it just gives her this name that turns her into a monster. Like you say, the Boogeyman, the Babadook. It's like, it sounds like those kind of words, doesn't it? Yeah,
I like it. Yeah, it's so creepy, that stuff. And again, that is when this novel is at its most effective, when it's reporting on stuff that's weird.
Yes, yes,
and it's quite disturbing because it's about kids going missing.
Yeah, and she's biting them, right? Yeah. The kids have wounds on their necks and all of that, and it's a really dark, creepy moment. Like, kids and infants are not safe in this story as well, and that's really interesting.
And he's another side character, isn't he? That reporter who keeps popping up.
Yes.
He's great. I really like him. And he goes to see that guy at the zoo. That's one of my... I'd forgotten about that completely.
Oh, the guy at the zoo. yeah.
Talking about the wolves.
Yeah, brilliant.
And Dracula,
Yeah.
Dracula had gone to the zoo, apparently. That's quite charming, isn't it?
I know, lovely. Well, he's in London.
He's in
seeing some
London. Might as well.
sights.
Yeah, and I think that's...
go
I was going to say that the baby in the bag thing, which I think is quite a famous moment. I also think this is something that I'd completely forgotten about, which is where the mother of that child turns up at the castle. That is horrible, and she's shouting through the gates, "Monster, give me my child!" And then I think what happens is the wolves are set on her, or she's kind of torn apart by a pack of wolves, and it's really properly horrible and devastating. You know, this is a woman who's had her baby stolen, and she's at the castle saying, "Give it back," and she's eaten by wolves, basically.
Yeah, it's great stuff. And again, like we've touched upon it already, but that whole first section in that castle and just all those descriptions, Dracula crawling up and down the walls and the kind of the maze-like sort of corridors and staircases and not being able to get out and locked doors and all of that kind of thing. It's a horrible kind of... It's like a nightmare, isn't it? That whole section, in a way. It's kind of weird and feverish and strange and dark, and it's great.
And I was surprised
the way he kind of doesn't really know what time of day it is, and like all of that kind of thing. It's so
it's so disorientating even to read it, I think. And the slight one thing I found really interesting was the ease of which he could get down from his window into Dracula's room and look at the body in the box. He does that a few times, I think, and that's really weird because it's like, oh my goodness, like, so in a modern novel, I think, or a modern movie, you'd have that moment, but there'd be nothing in the box or something like that.
Right. Yeah,
but in this, it's like, no, he's there, and he's laying there, and he's got blood around his mouth, and he looks, like he's been feeding, which he has, gorged with blood, I think it says at one point.
Yeah,
that's a cool bit.
It's very cool, isn't it? It's very cool.
I love the bit where the Demeter turns up in Whitby and we find out about this corpse being lashed to the steering wheel. What an amazing image.
Incredible. And like you say, that Demeter bit, like I always sort of feel, it's kind of pretty brief, actually, right, in the context of the book, but it really paints a picture of what happened. Like you said, this almost like slasher scenario where everyone's dead. And obviously there have been adaptations like the Mark Gatiss one where they really expanded that and made it more of a story, because there's just so much in that little moment, isn't there? It's so good.
Great. It's so cool. I mean, I for years have been saying that I want to do a stage adaptation of the Log of the Demeter. And then I read, obviously, that Mark Gatiss was exploring that in Dracula, and he does. And then also, I think there's going to be a movie called The Last Voyage of the Demeter. I think that's coming out.
Right.
So I've sort of shied away from doing it. But to be honest with you, every time I see something that tries to tackle it, I think, I've got a different perspective on it. I think it could be... And hopefully the movie that's coming out will do this, but it would work incredibly well as a slasher movie. Like it's so good, and you could even, hold back this idea that it's Dracula if you wanted to. You wouldn't have to name the ship even, I think. I don't want to give away the plot of my forthcoming play.
I love it, yeah. But it's true. It's that idea of this kind of ghost ship, I suppose, kind of rocking up on the shore, and it's great, isn't it? It's a really great moment, and that log, like you say, it's a brilliant.
Absolutely,
section.
I love, like I said, there's this bit where it's a bit confusing because we hear about a large dog leaping from the ship, which we assume is Dracula in the form of a dog. But then there's this small detail later on, not too far away from that moment, where it talks about, and I'll just read it. It goes, early this morning, this is part of a newspaper report. Early this morning, a large dog, a half-bred mastiff belonging to a coal merchant close to Tate Hill Pier, was found dead in the roadway opposite its master's yard. It had been fighting and manifestly had a savage opponent, for its throat was torn away and its belly was slit open as if with a savage claw. I mean, firstly, breaking the rule of killing a dog in
right.
In literature.
See, dogs and children in this story.
It's so brutal, and so it's. I read that and I was like, wow, there's no shying away from the gore here at all. It's so in your face, so bound up with horror. Again, to sort of consider it in that sense of it being that a disgust related experience.
Yes, it's just it. I guess that's it. It's like from the moment Dracula arrives, it's just death then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Death is kind of looming over all of these people. There's that moment when Mina they lose that old man that they've lived with for years, and there's this moment suddenly when like 3 or 4 people in her life die all at once, right?
Awful.
And this like spectre of death is just like coming for all of them, isn't there, at this point of the story?
Yeah.
It's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's some of the... So when Lucy dies, soon after that, Mina kind of pulls herself together again, and it feels a bit inauthentic. It's like you just lost like your best friend. It's really horrible.
Well, I think for me, from after they've killed undead Lucy, that is where it dips a bit for me. Towards the in that sort of final section, but up until that, I loved all the stuff with Lucy, being changed into being visited at night and then being turned into the van, them giving her all the garlic and then the mother taking it all away, and it's like, oh God, and that moment of kind of dread, and it's all that stuff I think was really great.
It is good. It's good storytelling, that stuff, and it feels quite Route One, but it's good horror storytelling, I think. Yeah, I mean, even like some of the descriptions of that staking scene, I think they're so interesting. There's a bit here: the thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut and the mouth was smeared with a crimson foam. It's horrible. Like, it's really violent. That extra detail of the undead Lucy biting her own lips so that they bleed is horrible. Yeah,
it's true. There's some genuine kind of body horror almost going on in this,
and it's one of those things that you talk about. I think you've spoken about it several times. Is the tiny injuries are always the worst in this sense, aren't they?
Yes.
Being blown to pieces is doesn't feel that horrible in a horror film, but it's when you get like a paper cut or a nail comes off or something, and biting your own lips with very sharp teeth till they bleed is not to labour the point over and over again, but I love it. It's great. No, it's so good at that kind of stuff. It's sensory, I think. This like with smells and with minute details and bodily bits, and all of that is so powerful. I think in this. What do you think of the ending? The way that this story kind of comes to a conclusion, then, because it's pretty swift. After like what feels like quite a long build up, then Dracula's disposed of. End. Yeah,
it's like
seriously,
wow.
seriously, it's like doesn't hang about at all, does it? A lot of ghost stories do that, and you get sort of a resolution, and then you just have a line that just says, "So ends the tale of," Maybe sometimes that's what we want, but there's quite a, when they start to conceive of the plan of what they're going to do, they're going to chase him. We know that he's on this boat because of Mina's psychic connection with him, and they're going to chase him to Transylvania. It's quite a long. It's quite a long bit, and it's the same beat really. And there's lots of back and forth, and there's some stuff with Van Helsing and the 3 vampire women at the castle, which I even on rereading I was like, I don't completely know what's going on here.
No,
but and then his servants, I suppose, in Transylvania try to get his box of earth away. He falls out. He sort of, the box hits the ground and he falls out. And then Harker kills him with that. I think it's called a cookery knife, not cookery, which I think it's cookery knife. And there are a couple of interesting things about it. One is, we've already said, he isn't staked. It says, but on the instant came the sweep and flash of Jonathan's great knife. I shrieked as I saw it shear through the throat, whilst at the same moment Mr. Morris's bowie knife plunged into the heart. It was like a miracle, but before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight.
Yeah.
And then he talks about how the face had a look of peace on it. That's so interesting to me, this idea that Dracula is actually all the way through reluctant vampire.
Yes, I think that's right, isn't it? And I think it goes in some ways going to lengths to say like it's not fun being a vampire, right? Like they're almost, these people are kind of tormented for hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, they're damned, I suppose, aren't they? That's the thing. And I suppose finally at peace by being disposed of at the end. That is really interesting.
It's quite religiously conservative way to end it, I think. But maybe that needed to be there in order for Stoker to, absolutely assert that this is a villain. And I think an interpretation is that that's another really interesting conflict in the character of Dracula.
So there you go. I mean, there's probably so much more we could dip into with this, but
we haven't talked about reverse colonialization. We haven't talked. We haven't talked about diseases of the blood. But this is the thing, isn't it, with this novel, that people can. There's so much in it, and there are so many takes on it, and there's so much written on it as well. There's so many interesting essays and stuff. But well,
I guess the last thing I want to ask you about is, there's never really been a very, very faithful adaptation of this. Even like you say, Bram Stoker's Dracula may be the closest thing to it out of most of the mainstream films, but even that has changed a lot and removed a lot as well. Like, what is it about this book that kind of both seems to inspire a lot of stories, but yet doesn't seem to lend itself to a faithful screen adaptation, do you think?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think, and I suspect that you've explored this a little bit with other guests on this series, but it feels like actually what's been remade is the 1931 movie. That's what's been remade several times. It's not necessarily the book that has been remade all these times.
And of course, the 1931 one really is an adaptation of the stage play of Dracula, not
precisely
Bram Stoker's novel.
Yeah. That first the stage play that was on Broadway, right? Exactly. I mean, maybe it's because there's quite a lot of explaining and a lot of dialogue heavy stuff in the middle that just doesn't work very well. The structure of the end, when they realize what the plan's going to be to the end, it's not all that interesting or exciting. There's not an awful lot of dramatic action from England to Transylvania. And I understand that, but I think you could do that in a montage.
Right,
quite
exactly.
satisfying. I really wish someone would do it. I really, really wish someone would do it. And I think you might say, well, do we really need to have another version of Dracula? Do we really need to have this Victorian text be done faithfully? Because I know that obviously Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat tried to do something a little bit more interesting, a little bit their own thing, and were somewhat successful. I mean, do you know what? I'm one of the few people who really enjoyed all of the episodes of it. I really quite liked it.
I loved the first two. I really didn't like the last one, but I applaud them for trying it. And I think one of the really interesting things, and we've talked about this, and Kim mentioned it as well, is that Dracula doesn't necessarily have to be a novel that belongs in 1897, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it was at the time, it was set in the present day, like you've mentioned. There's an emphasis on modern technology, on everything else. And so I get why Mark Gatiss did what he did with the third act of that. But I think some fans were disappointed because of exactly that, because we've still not had that yet. No. We've still not had the faithful adaptation.
I think we could do it, and I think it could still have in it. This is what I mean about mapping our own perceptions, our own contemporary takes on this novel from 1897. It could still have things to say to us as a 2022 audience, or whenever eventually it gets made. Even if you more or less did it absolutely faithfully, and the stuff that seems outdated, and old-fashioned, and politically against what we would want to, not chiming with our own political perspectives in 2022. Even that stuff would seem interesting, and I think someone should do it. I really do. And there are ways that you can modernise the characters, particularly of Mina and Lucy, by taking out some of the nonsense about the man's brain and all that stuff. And position Van Helsing and the other men as somewhat villainous in what they do. I think that is there in the text as you read it as a modern audience. Whether it was intended that way is kind of irrelevant, I would say.
100% agree with you. There's interesting stuff you can tell there if you tell it in the right way, definitely. And I think the other reason maybe that this book maybe has been sort of changed and warped is because of the lack of Dracula as well, right? Like, I think that's the other thing. Yeah, like the exactly. Like, I think you can see from a filmmaker's perspective, like, oh, our star doesn't really appear much after like the first act, you know.
But that makes it scarier.
It does make it scarier. It's very true. And it all depends on what you want from your Dracula, because do you want this dark, shadowy, undefinable thing looming over your bed at night, or do you want a charming leading man who can talk and be erudite? And exactly. That's it.
Like, this is what I mean. There's so much in it that would make it so scary and weird. And you know, if you stuck really faithfully to some of those descriptions of the various forms of Dracula, I think it could be really quite good.
Agreed.
But
agreed. Well, Adam, it's up to you. You'll have to make it.
Yeah. I mean, listen, if there's anyone listening who is interested in funding a...
I know. I mean, it's public domain, right? Anyone can go and make their own Dracula too, right?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. But without a backer, Mike, I don't really have time to do that.
I'm assuming you might need a bit of money. Fair enough.
Yeah. But I think, I think it will be redone at some point. I think,
no matter what, we continue to watch adaptations of Dracula. Like, it was only last year or the year before last, right? The last one for the BBC, and everyone tuned in. Everyone had an opinion on it. Like, no matter what, and no matter how many versions of this story we've seen, we keep wanting more, don't we? And that's fascinating in itself.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, maybe we've done Jonathan the Castle quite a lot.
We really have.
The other thing that's interesting, I think, is this posthumously published story Dracula's Guest, which actually was originally going to be the first chapter of the novel. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it, and I recommend it to anyone who's listening. If you have, you can get hold of it online, all over the place. It's public domain. It's really interesting, and it's weird and it's scary, and there are parallels with Carmilla going on in there, and
that's right. Well, actually, funnily enough, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be covering Universal's Dracula and its two sort of sequels, Dracula's Daughter and Son of Dracula, and they're really interesting films. Actually, neither of them have Dracula in them. Neither of them have Bela Lugosi in them.
Yeah.
But Dracula's Daughter the plan was it was going to be an adaptation of Dracula's Guest, but actually I think it ended up getting rewritten. Actually, I think it shares a lot more with Carmilla in the end than it does Dracula's Guest. But like you say, there are parallels between those two stories anyway. But Dracula's Daughter is the first lesbian vampire movie on screen as well. But so it's all really interesting. But it's like this story that kind of keeps spanning all these other little stories, doesn't it? That's the thing.
I know, right?
There you go. Well, there we go. Adam, what joy. Thank you so much for doing this. I mean, you're absolutely the perfect person to do this because you have your own podcast where you discuss ghost stories and ghost literature. Would you ever discuss Dracula on your podcast?
Do you know what? We did an episode called The Judge's, about a story called The Judge's House, and that was with Lauren Owen, who wrote a novel called The Quick. I think I mentioned her earlier. And we do talk about Dracula a little bit in that. We talk about Bram Stoker. Lauren really, really, really knows her stuff, and did a PhD on Dracula as that and various other things in that area, and she's so smart on it, and she taught me lots of bits and pieces. We've talked about Dracula in that area. I'm planning series 3 at the moment, and I've had a few conversations with people. In fact, one person said, can we do Carmilla? And I'm like, I really want to do it, but also I think it might be a little bit too far outside of the ghost story. I've sort of backed I should have called it the Gothic Book Club. Why did I call it the Ghost Story Book Club?
I mean, ghost story can be that can be a broad term in this day and age.
I think So perhaps we wouldn't do an episode on Dracula as such, but maybe Dracula's Guest, because it's about the right length of the sorts of stories we cover. But I really encourage people to check out that episode, The Judge's House, and if people haven't read The Judge's House as a short story, it's really good. good. It's really scary. It's quite nasty. Like it really goes to a place that actually in some ways Dracula does, that kind of proper horror, surprisingly brutal place. There is an archetype, there is a figure in that which is this doctor who's got a bit of Van Helsing about him. And the judge, the titular judge is a bit Dracula-y in some ways. But not entirely, but a bit.
Very cool. Well, yeah, I mean, I'd recommend everyone check out all of Adam's podcast, the Ghost Story Book Club. It's such a good podcast, and you have such great, clever guests on there as well.
It's very, like, I say this affectionately, and I say it about myself, it's very nerdy, and I really own that. I love that. I like the nerdiness of it. I'm a total Ghost Story nerd. I love that stuff. It's fun, and we've had some really lovely guests, and Series 3 hopefully coming in autumn, winter. I'm just pulling all that together, and some really exciting people going to be on that as well.
Amazing. How exciting. Well, Adam, thank you so much. And anything else you want to plug? Anything else people should be looking out for in the near future from you?
I'm in a bit of a sort of in-between place at the moment where we've just finished development of, or the first stage of development of a new play called Unhomely, which we really hope will be touring in autumn-winter 2023. That's another ghost story show with integrated BSL and VV, visual vernacular, which means it's accessible for deaf audiences and people who use BSL. It's also going to be accessible for blind and visually impaired audiences, because we're going to make sure that all elements of it are just accessible, because it'll be led by storytelling. So hopefully that will mean that we reach an even more broad audience. That's not till next year though. I'm planning a tour of a very small thing, which is basically me telling some classic ghost stories called Haunted. We were hoping for a massive tour this autumn winter, but it hasn't really come about for various different reasons. But I'm hoping to pull together something so it'll be popping up here and there in various unusual places. So Unhomely is going to be this big theatrical experience, and Haunted is kind of going to be me sometimes, maybe even in a library with some candles.
And some amazing.
Yeah. So it's I've gone completely like the opposite of what we've been doing the last few years, which is this big theatrical experience, and it'll just be me and the stories. And then there's my Patreon. If it's all right to just give that a little plug,
of course.
Where I do audio productions of various classic stories. I do lots of creative writing workshops, and I do events, so live readings of ghost stories and open mic nights and folklore evenings. It's really fun. And yeah, people can join me on there, which is patreon.com/Adam Z Robinson. And there's a version of the log of the Demeter on there.
Oh, perfect. Well, there we go. Excellent tie-in. I love it. Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, mate. Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's two incredible guests. I could not have done this without them both, Adam Robinson and Kim Newman. Well, there we go. There was probably so much more we could have covered, but we are just getting started on Dracula. But I'd love to hear what you guys thought of this week's discussion and what you think of Dracula, the novel. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, and you can find us on all the socials. And don't forget, if you follow us on Letterboxd, you can keep up to date with what movies we're going to be covering this series over the next few months. If you want to sign up for extra bonus episodes every single week, then you can sign up to our Patreon channel, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. This week's bonus episode was a really fun Friday the 13th special, in which me and my dream warriors Becky Dark and Stevie Webb discussed Friday the 13th Part 5 and Friday the 13th Part 6 back to back, which was a very funny pairing to look at in succession, and if you've seen both films you'll understand why. So loved that episode, and there's a whole bunch of other episodes you can check out if you sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast on all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. All right then, on to next week, and finally, the movie deep dive discussions begin. Next week, I'm going to be joined by James Swanton, and we're going to be discussing one of the very first Dracula adaptations, one of the very first vampire movies, one of the very first horror movies, you could even argue. We're going to be discussing Nosferatu from 1922 in spoilerific detail. Then, in the second half of the episode, we'll be discussing one of the lesser-known vampire classics, but an absolutely fascinating movie, Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire from 1932. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.